most interested in making sure are having a chance to be addressed. So with that, though, we are at the top of the hour. We're setting up our meeting here on YouTube as well. Feel free in the chat. You're welcome in the meantime to share where you might be calling in from, what brought you here. And obviously, let me get this out of the way. Let's do some housekeeping. So hello and welcome to all of our attendees. And we are at 30. So feel free in the meantime to follow us on Poll EV as well as all of our social channels. You can share in the chat where you might be calling in from. And with that, we'd love to welcome you to this week's Citizens Climate Core Volunteer Training. We're having it an earlier time, so thanks for adjusting your own Tuesday after work commitments to join us live from France for a Climate Economics AMA with Dr. Adrien Fabre. We're going to have a chance to learn from Adrien about his research. A little bit of housekeeping. Everyone is muted. We are recording this line. For anyone that has any tech challenges, we welcome you to turn off your video, close other programs. You can privately chat me if you need, but for now, know that we're also streaming to our YouTube channel, and I'll put a link where you can find out more information about that. You're also welcome with your speaker view to toggle and see, if you keep your video on, all the other attendees in this era of social distance, how to feel that connection, at least digitally. If Adrien or Jonathan says anything particularly funny or salient, you can click on the reactions area and let them get a little love for anything that you feel like is something worth acknowledging. In the meantime, in the chat, like people have shared, feel free where you're calling in from and post your questions as we get going here at pollev.com/CCL123. We'll have that available several times throughout. So with that, though, let me introduce our speaker and then pass it to Jonathan, who will be emceeing the rest of the event. Dr. Adrien Fabre is a member of CCL France. His PhD is from Paris School of Economics, and he works as a permanent researcher at CIRED in Paris on economics relevant to climate change, which is why this is such a wonderful intersection for tonight's AMA. And so we're going to hear specifically about some of the research that Adrien's been doing on the international level, but know that the research agenda that he entails is very broad and conducts international surveys to survey the political economy, a topic very close to my own heart, on the politics of climate change. So thank you so much, Adrien, for joining us. And Jonathan has a little bit of a surprise that I'll pass to him to introduce further, and then the floor is yours.
Thanks, Brett. Well, I'm Jonathan Marshall, CCL's Research Coordinator for Economics. And I've had the pleasure of sort of corresponding with Adrien on some of my writing based on his research. And so I'm delighted to help introduce him. And I'm so glad he could join us today at a very late hour at his time, I might add. Just a few comments on his education and career before launching him. I was struck looking at his resume, how much difficulty Adrien had making up his mind what to study as an undergraduate. In addition to taking classes on salsa and rock and roll, he ended up earning separate degrees in mathematics, economics, and law. He finally settled down, though, and decided to pursue economics, and wrote his 2016 master's thesis at the Paris School of Economics on international preferences for income distribution, under the supervision of the world-famous economist Thomas Piketty, who's many of you may have heard of. Since then, Adrien has been a visiting scholar at New York University. He joined the International Center for Research on the Environment and Development in Paris. He's promoted novel ideas for cyber democracy, produced videos for YouTube on humanist proposals, participated in CCL's French chapter, as you can see here, and co-authored several important papers related to climate policy and public attitudes, which is the focus of his talk today. As I mentioned, I've had the pleasure of writing extensively about one of these papers, actually two of them, on Nerd Corner, and I'll put a link into, whoops, I guess those links don't come through. I'll put some links in for that Nerd Corner piece, and also for a new research guide, including that last study that was just posted on Nerd Corner. So Adrien, why don't you take it away and talk to us about some of your most recent research?
Hi, so thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you everyone for inviting me, and I'm very excited to present my work to you. The work I focus on today is a joint work with Antoine de Chelopret from the OECD, Stephanie Sanjeva from Harvard, Tobias Cruz, Valerie Planteros, and Anna Sanchez-Chico. It's one big survey covering 20 countries, among the biggest in the world, on attitudes towards climate change and climate policies. So we paint the high-income countries in different colors than the middle-income countries because our survey are very representative in high-income countries, but not so representative in middle-income countries where we have trouble reaching low-educated people living in rural areas. So you should take the result in the middle-income countries with a grain of salt. So there is some papers already, some studies on climate attitudes around the world, and they find that most people are concerned about climate change and want to fight it, like 80% of people in every country, more or less. Then there is a vast literature on the reasons why people support some climate policies, in particular carbon pricing. And the main result is that people support it at three conditions: when they perceive it as effective at reducing CO2 emission, as fair or progressive, meaning that low-income people are not hurt by the policy, and in their own self-interest. So what we bring to this literature is to extend it in many countries, while the current literature studies these specific policies only in high-income countries, and to also cover many different policies, not just the carbon tax. So I will go, I will rush through the slides, so I don't have time to explain you all the video treatments that people see or don't see. We start the survey with an open-ended question. What are your main considerations regarding climate change? And here we can see that most people worry about climate change or say that we should act, although fewer people mention a specific activity that we should do to tackle climate change. And you can see here that in the US, it's the country with the least share of people who worry about climate change. It's very an outlier among the other country. In the US, the debate is very polarized, as you know, and kind of backwards compared to the rest of the world, because in the US, in the open-ended question, people debate about the reality of climate change and the importance to fight it, while in other countries, it's more about what should we do to fight it, should we switch to renewable or nuclear, or stop deforestation? That's very high in Brazil, or switch to electric cars. In the US, they scarcely mention such things. Yet people in every country, even in the US, a large majority of people agree that climate change is an important problem. So I skip the knowledge about climate change. Just so knowledge is quite balanced. So some people know things like that climate change will lead to disasters. People all even exaggerate the disasters. And in terms of what causes climate change, people have a pretty accurate view, although they tend to underestimate the emission of the Americans and overestimate the per capita emission of Chinese. Who has better knowledge? Those with a college degree and left-wing people, higher income people as well, but to a lesser extent. Now let's switch to climate attitudes. So first result is that people have green views on the future in almost every country except China, India, Indonesia. People think that the world in 100 years from now will be poorer, that it's not technically feasible to stop emissions in the next century. It's not likely that we will do it. And the majority of people even think that it's likely that unabated climate change causes the extinction of humankind. I personally think that it's exaggerated, but so people worry a lot about climate change, not for themselves, because only a minority feel personally affected by climate change or think that they will do, but people think that it's the generation of their children or grandchildren that will suffer. Switching to support for climate policies. So here are all the policies for which we test the support. So we ask the support on a Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree, with the middle answer of indifferent. So if you exclude the indifferent answers, you have mostly blue everywhere, meaning that there is a relative majority in favor of almost every climate policy that we tested. There are a few exceptions. A tax on fossil fuels, where we don't specify what we do with the revenues, is not supported by a majority. A tax on flying is not supported by a majority in the US, although it is in most of other countries where people fly less. And a high tax on beef, cattle products, is also not supported by a majority, because many people don't know that beef it causes a lot of emission. So now I'll switch back to the absolute level of support, so where we don't exclude indifferent answers, because we see here better the ranking of the different policies. So you see that some policies even get an absolute majority support. So they are very strongly supported. These are the Green Infrastructure Program, so kind of the Green Deal, or the Build Back Better plan, with $1 trillion investment in public transportation, renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, retrofits of buildings. People like subsidies to low carbon technologies for the same reason. People like investment, and people like that alternatives to fossil fuels are being offered. They like less a ban on combustion engine cars by 2030, although in many countries, including the US, there is still a relative majority in favor of it. And people like it better if the ban is complemented by by alternatives being made available, like better public transportation. Surprisingly, people are quite supportive of mandates, restriction and bans, like a mandatory installation of buildings by 2040, where half of the cost would be subsidized by the government, as well as a ban on putting cars in city centers, what we call low emission zones. These are strongly supported, perhaps because they come with co-benefits, such as less air pollution and better thermal comfort. Now, we test different variants of the carbon tax depending on how we use the revenues. And depending on the revenue use, the support can be very strong when it's used to fund green infrastructures or subsidize low emission technology, or very low when we propose to reduce corporate income taxes or unequal cash transfers to all households, which is the same as this policy. Actually, we tested twice. And so why don't people like this policy, which is the one that CCL advocates? Well, because they don't, many of them don't understand that it's progressive. And when we say cash transfers would be targeted to the poorest households, so that people really understand that it's progressive, that it helps poor families, then the support increases. And you see, you almost have an absolute majority support for these variants. And you have 70 for these variants, you have 62% of relative majority support. So that's a good news for CCL. An originality of this survey is that we also ask the support for global policies, and people really like global policies. The first way to see that is we ask at which level they would like climate policies to be enacted, and most people choose the global level, and fewer of them choose the federal level or the state level. In the case of the US, they could tick several answers here. And in every country, the global level is the most chosen one. We also propose to people global emission trading scheme. So explaining that we would divide the global carbon budgets in a global quota that decreases every year, divided in tradable emission rights. And people really support this policy. So actually in the US, we don't ask the question that way. So that's why there are some stars here. We ask the question differently, but the bottom line is that people like this global emission trading scheme. And when we ask them how should we allocate the shares of emission rights across countries, the most consensual answer is to have the emission share in proportion to population, which amounts to an equal right to emit per capita across the world. People also support historical responsibilities, so giving more right to emit to countries that emitted less in the past, or to countries who will be hurt more by the consequences of climate change. So if you think of a global carbon price that funds where the emission rights are equal for each human, it's equivalent to a global carbon tax that finances a global basic income. So the policy that CCL advocates, but just at the global level. So this is basically the same policy as here, but you see that here it's much less supported. Why? Because in this version of the question, at this stage of the questionnaire, we specify to the respondent the implication in terms of monetary loss. So we make clear that an American person, a typical American person, would lose out about $85 per month because the $30 in basic income that they would receive each month would not compensate the price increases they will face. And people realizing that support it less. So there isn't even relative majority support here. Nonetheless, there is strong support for other global policies, such as a global tax on millionaires that would finance public services and infrastructures in low-income countries that comply with climate targets. There is also strong support for a democratic assembly of people elected on the global list that would draft international treaties to be approved by governments on climate change. So support for climate policies is higher for left-leaning people, for people with a college degree, and for people who live in an area where public transport is available. Gender is not associated that much with supporting the policy, and age, it depends on the country. In countries like the US, older people support climate policies less, but it's not the case in Asian countries. And income is not associated with more support in the US. What explains the support are the beliefs rather than the socio-demographics. So I'll go quickly through that, but basically, these are the perceptions of each of our three main policies that we test. You can focus on the middle column because this is the policy advocated by CCL, and look at this column that includes the US. So basically, people understand that carbon tax with cash transfers and other climate policies would be effective at changing incentives and reducing CO2 emissions. People are divided into three-thirds, into those who see good effect on the economy and employment, those who see bad effect, and those who see neither like intermediate effect. But people perceive climate policies as regressive, in the sense that only a minority see the middle class, low-income earners, or people living in rural areas, or people like their household as winning from the policy, and more people see high-income earners as winning from the policy. So this explains a low support because people see the policy as unfair. You see that the fairness of the policy and the support are very close and very correlated. So indeed, when we regress the support for all climate policies on a range of perceptions, what matters the most is the perceptions that the policy are effective at reducing CO2 emission, the belief that I would not lose if the policy is enacted, and as we saw earlier, the fairness, so that low-income people would not lose. Other beliefs like trusting the government, caring about inequality, the views about the future, the knowledge of climate change are correlated, but much less with the support. Here, it's another way to see that. You see that here the belief altogether explains 70% of the answers. But if you look only at the sociodemographics, like the country, the gender, etc., it explains a very low share. All the sociodemographic together explain only 20% of the differences in answers. Something that we see in our surveys is that the distribution is critical. So, for example, when we ask what sources of funding people find appropriate for public investment in wind infrastructure, by far people favor increasing taxes on the wealthiest rather than, for example, our default option that would be additional public spending. And there are several ways to see that throughout the surveys. I won't go into the details. People care a lot about distributional issues. In our survey, we also have pedagogical videos. So one video that informs people about the impacts of climate change in their country. One video that explains each of our three main climate policies, the three that are here. And some respondents see both videos, some see none of them. And the videos are quite effective at increasing the support for the policies, in particular in the case of the carbon tax. Why? For two reasons. First, it starts from a lower baseline support, so there is more room to increase the support. And second, people really learn something in the climate policy video here. And what they learn is that a carbon tax with equal cash transfers is progressive, that rich people lose and poor people win with such a policy. So we measure that they learn that, and this explains the higher support. So to sum up, an information campaign would be effective in improving the support, but it should rather address climate policies rather than climate change, because people are already very concerned about climate change. The reason why people support climate policies are the beliefs that it's effective, that it's fair, and that they would not lose themselves. So it's important to make sure that the policy packages are progressive and people understand that. Third point, the most popular kind of national policies are investment in green infrastructure, because people need alternatives like public transportation or electric charging station to be able to switch from behavior. People like policies that come with co-benefits, like a ban on polluting vehicles in dense areas, or mandatory and subsidized installation of buildings. And they like less a ban on combustion engine cars or a carbon tax with cash transfers. So perhaps a good plan for a climate policy package would be to kickstart it with investment and like subsidizing the installation of buildings, things like that, and tell to people that in 5 years from now, there will be a rising carbon price. So they should rather profit now from the subsidies of the government to switch their equipment, and they won't have to pay the carbon tax in the future. The last point I want to emphasize is that our surveys suggest that people are ready for international solidarity. And actually, I'm running a new survey right now on this precise question that confirms the previous results. So people would be ready for global policies, including if they redistribute, if there are transfers from high-income countries to low-income countries. So before switching to the Q&A, I'll just give a word to give you ideas of questions to ask also about a previous work I did in France. So kind of the same survey, but that dig into more detailed. So it was done at the time of the Yellow Vest, and the support was very low. You see that the support for the carbon tax with cash transfers really dropped during the Yellow Vest movement, and it recovered slowly thereafter. It was higher also before the Yellow Vest movement. So this showed that people opinion is very influenceable by the political events. What we also learned from this work, and we really showed causally, like in a kind of proper academic way, that the effectiveness, progressivity, and self-interest do matter for accepting a carbon tax. And yeah, I can talk you more about the Yellow Vest if you want. I can also show you primary results of the new survey I'm doing in the US and in Europe on global climate policies, if you'd like. Thank you for your attention, and yeah, sorry for rushing, but I have a lot of material to cover. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Adrien, for that presentation. And I'm sure that will provoke a lot of questions. I wanted to kick it off with a couple of questions. The first one is very general, which is why does an economist, in fact, several economists, get involved in this kind of survey research, which maybe isn't the usual kind of subject matter? Obviously, economists are all over climate policy issues, but what brings you to do survey research, and what kinds of tools from your economics toolbook do you use to facilitate this research?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so actually I generally present myself as a social scientist rather than an economist, precisely because I'm doing kind of this survey research. I'm more driven by the research question, and my research question for my PhD was, is decarbonization feasible? And I started to address the question from kind of technical perspective, and then it became clear to me that yes, technically it's feasible. And then the Yellow Vest came out, and it became clear to me that the main obstacle was not technical but political. And we know what we should do, but we're not doing it. And I wanted to understand why we're not doing it. What would people be ready to accept, and under what conditions?
Great. Well, that also tees up my second question, which you've already alluded to a couple of times, and that's about the Yellow Vest movement. And without necessarily getting us into the weeds of, French attitudes, Tell us just a little bit more, because I think many of our members have, seen references to the Yellow Vest movement, heard of it. It certainly brought out as a kind of boogeyman of the dangers that carbon pricing advocates can run into if they don't manage this policy correctly. Tell us a little bit about what the Yellow Vest movement was and what kind of impact it had. If you were in France at the time, what did it look like to you?
Yes, so thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about the Yellow Vest, because I think it's something that is poorly understood, especially outside France. So first, the context is that the French government had planned a rising carbon price, but this was done like 1 year before the Yellow Vest. So the policy was not new, and every political parties agreed on that measure. Or even Le Pen, the extreme right, they didn't complain about it at the time, and so it was supposed to rise step by step every year until 100 euros per ton by 2030. Then Macron made it quicker, and it had
He was the French president.
Yes, and wanted to reach 100 euros by 2022, I think. So in 5 years instead of 12, and but this was quite consensual. Then they at the same time they repealed the wealth tax, so to say, or they really decreased the wealth tax, and kind of the same amount of the carbon tax, right? And then oil prices surged, and there was a petition against the rise of fossil fuel prices that was very popular. It was a buzz on social media, and people convened in roundabouts with their yellow vest every day. For like they self-organized on Facebook. Political parties were completely overpassed, or and same for unions. And first, so there was two sides of the movement. There was the daily movements all over France, except perhaps in Paris, but especially in rural areas, where people really met each other, people that they didn't know, and they started to talk about politics, things that they usually didn't do. It's many people that never voted, etc. Every kind of people. So I think that this side of the movement was actually a very good thing for our democracy, because it pushed people to think about politics, people that never did before. It created human contact between people, etc. And the other side was that every Saturday, people would come to Paris for a demonstration, and some of them were very violent, and the police responded even more violently. Like the police made I don't know, like between 30 and 100 people lose their arm, 5 people lose their eye. Like we often think of the yellow vest, I think, in international media as being violent, but I guess that the police was the most violent. Anyway, people were initially protested. Like what sparked the yellow vest was this rising fuel prices, but the movement itself was much broader than that. It was an anti-elite movement, and so revendicating more purchasing power and more democracy. So Macron, after 2 months of movement, gave a speech to calm them down, and said, we will raise the minimum wage by 7%, and I will freeze the carbon tax. And then it was more or less around Christmas, and the movement really decreased in intensity, perhaps by half or even more, but it still continued. And 3 months after, Macron came again and said, and then after that time, the main revendication of the movement was the referendum of citizens' initiative, something that you have in California, that people can propose a ballot, and then there is a referendum, and people could also propose to repeal a law that has just been voted. And Macron, 3 months after, made new announcements, including that he would deliver this referendum thing. And then the movement really disappeared after that. So this shows that the movement was not primarily about the carbon price. It was about purchasing power and democracy. And I think that the government made a mistake when they decided to freeze the carbon tax. We often hear the Yellow Vest movement made the government freeze the carbon tax. No, they decided this themselves. And I think the government would have had pretty much the same result if they had said instead, look, we put back the wealth tax and we use the revenues from the carbon tax to fund a climate income. Yeah.
Great.
And something to support my point. The woman who launched the petition at the origin of the movement, she ended up supporting CCL's proposal of a carbon tax with climate income.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. Again,
You're
it
welcome.
goes back to your point about the perception of fairness is extremely important, because in many carbon tax scenarios, there isn't a refund of income to either all households or to the poorest households. Combining it with the wealth tax really kind of stuck it to people. I think the American Congress was very aware, despite CCL's efforts to continue its push for a carbon tax, that in 2022, with the sharp rise in fuel prices caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that was probably not the ideal time to start imposing taxes on higher taxes on fuel. So there was a very poor timing and so on of the French proposals that got into trouble. Well, why don't we open this up to audience questions here? Brett, do I need to, okay, here we're going to see. So I guess the top question here is, what is the most profound insight for CCL in your opinion? Talking to politicians, in terms both of talking to politicians and talking to the public.
So I think so I would say, so one insight is that there is more support that people may think after the Yellow Vest. I don't know how it is in the US, but in France, in Europe, people have been shocked by the Yellow Vest and interpret it as a dislike for carbon pricing. Although as I told you, I don't buy this interpretation. So on the contrary, there is support for carbon pricing and for climate policies in general, to the extent that they are perceived as fair. And a climate income is a way to increase this fairness perception. Perhaps an insight for CCL is that it's perceived as more fair. It's more perceived as fair if the climate income is targeted to low-income households. So you can make it higher for low-income people, for example. The similar insights of like what CCL could change in their the policies they support is the strong support for global policies and a global carbon fee and dividend. This is even fairer, and this is more effective at addressing climate change. So perhaps this will be the next fight of CCL once they will have succeeded in implementing the carbon fee and dividend in some countries. Yeah.
And Adrien, one of the strongest takeaways I got from your study is that it's important not only to shape policies in ways that, are appropriate to public attitudes, but also to educate them, because they're not always aware of how your policies work.
Yeah.
Both in terms of climate effectiveness and in progressivity. And I think the single strongest jump in support had to do with what we call carbon fee and dividend, when you expose people to very, very short videos on climate impact and on the kind of financial impact. You got a 12 or 13 point jump in support. So it seems to me that very much supports CCL's mission of educating the public and policymakers about what this policy can do. And so if you want to comment on that, and then also maybe address the next highest question of what research tell us about the best way to deliver the education required to increase public acceptance of carbon fee and dividend.
Yes, so that's very true. CCL already does the right job on that because CCL educates people on a carbon fee and dividend when other climate activists spend a lot of time educating people on climate change, but that job is already done. The fear I have is that we're not the only one. There is also Fox News, etc., and they are trying to educate people on the opposite direction, right? So I think it's not only important to spread the right messages, but also to avoid that the enemies spread fake news and fake information. For example, I've lived in Zurich for 2 years, and during a campaign on a referendum for a carbon tax with dividend, and the referendum was lost. And the campaign was very, I mean, the largest party in Switzerland is the extreme right party, SVP, and they are very good communicators, and they spread lies, and there were posters in the streets explaining that only rich people will be able to drive on the highways after the carbon tax is passed. Although the dividend would have made the policy progressive, but that's totally wrong. High income people would have been made worse off. So and that's a much harder problem to tackle, right? How to prevent other actors to deliver some message. Now on climate communication more generally, I can give some result from other studies. People trust, I mean, sources, some specific sources. So they don't pay attention to information if it's not conveyed by the right source. So if it's conveyed by their local church, by their friends, by people they trust in general, they will shift their beliefs. But if it's conveyed by a politician from the party they don't like, it will not shift their belief, quite the contrary. So perhaps here the insight is to bring Republicans on board, or to bring on board communities that are not specifically pro climate activists. Perhaps churches are good targets. They're not anti-climate, but you know that's one thing.
I would add there that CCL has an action team of conservatives who are precisely trying to do this, act as trusted voices within the Republican Party and among other conservatives who may or may not have a party allegiance to convey these messages. And then back to you.
Yeah, no, I think that's the only idea I have on
Okay,
that.
great.
In my
I'm going to skip a question, although invite someone in the chat to explain about the Yale Center for Climate Communications, what the asker of that thought the discrepancy was. You've already mentioned who some of the best messengers are. And now, what do you think are the advantages of a political economy lens for your research compared to a more traditional pure economics approach?
So pure economics traditionally has looked at the optimal thing to do. But that's not the same thing as the politically feasible thing to do. And then what would be pure economics that tries to tackle the political economy aspect would be to make a model where people vote in function of their financial interest. And that's not how people reason and behave. And that's why I'm doing surveys, is to understand how people reason about these things, what are their attitudes. And also because we may have wrong beliefs about what other people think, and then wrong belief about what is politically feasible or not feasible. So I think it's important to give a say to random citizens, to the laymen and women, to understand what we want collectively. Yeah.
Right. I wanted to pull out a question with a slight twist, but I think it's in the spirit of the question. You alluded to the popularity of a global solution that essentially provided equal rights to pollute effectively to every individual. And then you ratchet that down, hopefully, to get towards a net zero solution. And I can see how that would intuitively strike respondents as very, very fair and be popular. But I wonder about 30 seconds of education by a hostile group saying, gee, that means people in Africa get to pollute a lot more than they are now, and you're going to have to cut your lifestyle way back. How fair would that seem once people realize the implications to the rich countries?
So because the emission rights are tradable, it doesn't mean that that next year you have to cut your emission from 20 tons to 2 tons, right? And when we describe the policy, we make very clear the implication. We say, so it would be a loss for the typical American of $85 per month, which we compute using a carbon price of $90 per ton. So of course it may rise more in the future, but in the short run, that's already high. And the support decreases when we make clear the incidence. It decreases, but it's still. I mean, the result from our new survey, we explain it. We explain it even better to the respondents, and the support is above 50%, slightly above 50%. So somehow, oh yes, and something also that we do in this new survey is that we describe another policy that's a national redistribution scheme that takes from the top 5% in the US and redistributes $85 per month to each American. So to offset the global carbon fee and dividend. So the typical American would neither win nor lose with both policies combined. Of course, the highest emitters and the richest Americans would lose, but it's still sufficient to get majority support if everyone defends their financial interest. And actually, it doesn't change much the support, whether the global carbon fee dividend is complemented by this national redistribution or not. it increases the support by 5 percentage points, not more. Meaning that probably for many people, $85 per month is affordable. Or for those that are concerned for the climate and for global poverty, they are willing to afford this amount, and we don't we don't increase the support by a lot by complementing this with the national redistribution.
You alluded in your discussion to the fact that support for maybe carbon pricing might grow as people see more options for changing their lifestyle. In other words, if there's subsidies for public transportation and or for EVs for that matter, or building insulation, people are more friendly towards this. Do you think the policies in the Inflation Reduction Act sort of align with those comments and make a friendlier environment for carbon pricing in the future?
So I don't recall every policy that was in this act. It goes in the right direction, of course. It's clearly not enough. I mean, the European Union is doing quite well on climate policy. The US is not, I think. I mean, due to Joe Manchin, but so yes, it goes in the right direction to provide alternatives to people, like charging station, subsidies to retrofits, building, etc. On the side of caution, I would say, so we saw a strong support for like mandatory installation of building and for a ban of polluting vehicles from city centers, but that was a snapshot last year. And perhaps when these policies get real and people really understand that they cannot drive their car anymore in the center of their town, they would start opposing them. So as we saw with the carbon tax during the Yellow Vest movement, the attitudes can change quite quickly.
I guarantee you nothing like that was in the Inflation Reduction Act. So you were not long ago yourself an undergraduate, and we have a number of students listening in. What advice do you have for undergraduates interested in climate research?
It's a tough question.
I know it's a little broad, but maybe you've got some.
Yeah, because if I had a great idea to study, I would do it myself. But yeah, I guess it's important to be curious about other issues, not focus on climate change, and not forget that it's not the only issue. Global poverty is a big one, wars, the rights of women, especially in low-income countries, the scarcity of some resources like phosphorus, how to build a sustainable agriculture in the future. So, and why it's important to have these other issues in mind is that they are often interrelated with climate change. And when you think of all of this together, then you understand why like having the carbon fee and dividend at the global level is a better solution, because at the same time it helps fighting global poverty and creating a sense of cooperation among countries. Yeah.
And by the same token, there are many ways to study that variety of issues, and your own training showed a curiosity about economics, law, even mathematics. So maybe it strikes me that one can be interested in climate research through training in a variety of different fields. There's a variety of ways to come at this question. It's so big. Is that a fair observation from your own experience?
Yes, definitely. I think it's always valuable to have to have interdisciplinarity. If one as an specialist of something, it's also very good, and then it's very able to collaborate with other people with other expertise. For undergraduates, I would recommend to study math because it's very important, especially statistics. I think it's useful everywhere for any other discipline afterwards.
I'm going to go ahead and answer a question that came in, and you can elaborate. The question is, are the explainer videos you use in your research available? And the answer is yes. And in fact, in my Nerd Corner forum post, which I linked to in the chat, I actually copied and pasted in the transcript of one of the videos related to the kind of financial impact of fee and dividend. So it's really helpful to have that because you always want to know, is this poll biased in some way? You know, what did the researchers, how did they frame the issue? And so it's very educational. And so you can either go to the original study, which has supplementary materials linked to, or you can just go to my Nerd Corner post.
Yeah, it's something in the appendix of the study. I can show you 1 minute of the video if you want, if I share my screen.
Oh, okay, sure.
I'm not sure though, that that it will work with this with the sound, but let's try. So I can show the part of the US policy video that talks about
to compensate people for higher prices.
Do you hear the sound?
Yes.
Yes, okay, that's great. So it's the part that explains, okay, I can show you the whole part about the carbon tax with cash transfers, actually.
Now, let's turn to a policy that combines a tax on carbon emissions to reduce emissions and cash transfers to protect people's purchasing power. With a carbon tax, all products that emit greenhouse gases would be taxed. For example, the price of gasoline would increase by 40 cents per gallon. With a carbon tax, companies and people pay for the greenhouse gases they emit. This pushes them to reduce their emissions. To compensate people for higher prices, the revenues of the carbon tax would be redistributed to all households, regardless of their income. Each adult would thus receive $600 per year. On average, poorer people own smaller cars, live in smaller houses, and fly less, so they use less fossil fuels than average. As they would receive the same cash transfer as everyone else, poorer people will generally gain from a carbon tax with cash transfers. Conversely, rich people will tend to lose. Does this pop?
Yeah, there is.
Work? Yes. The Canadian province of British Columbia has had a carbon tax with cash transfers since 2008. Research has shown that this policy has decreased carbon emissions, increased employment, and made a majority of people richer. The last policy is a large...
Yeah, so that was it.
Right,
and yeah, you can find the rest of the videos. There is a link on the appendix of the big paper.
right. And as I said, there is a transcript available to that as well. So that's great. I think we're about ready to wrap up. Brett, do you want to do the honors? And I'd just like to remind people that Adrien has kindly, it's nearly midnight his time. So he's gone out of his way to help us here, which I really appreciate.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're going to unmute all lines here in just a moment, Adrien, to give you a huge resounding round of applause. This was so helpful. We're so grateful for researchers like you making yourself available to advocates like yourself to be more informed and armed with the best available data. Just a quick promo for anyone interested that's not aware on the line of the important work that Jonathan and the rest of the research team are doing in CCL's Nerd Corner. If you have ongoing questions or ideas that you'd like to share to the nerd curious climate community within CCL, feel free to jump on board. That link is just cclusa.org/nerd corner. That's originally where we highlighted the important research that Adrien has been doing, as well as all of the rest of the discussions that you can take part in. So check that out. And Jonathan, I think, can easily put a link to that in the chat. If you're curious after tonight about our upcoming trainings, you can go to our events tab and find out more information. For the sake of time, though, I won't detail that too much. I did want to highlight that you're more than welcome to also get credit for understanding a little bit more about really this public opinions research in our Action Tracker training. I'll put a link to that where you can automatically get credit for attending tonight's training in the chat in just a bit. But for all of us that have attended on YouTube, we will have this available not only in the live stream channel, but as a downloaded stream available as of tomorrow. For those of you that aren't familiar with CCL and would like to join our work, that short link is also available there. And then to find out more about the ongoing work and curriculum vitae that Adrien has, feel free to check out the website and the research of his ongoing excellent scholarship. So with that, Adrien, is there any last reflection or thought that you'd like to share before we unmute all lines to thank you for your excellent scholarship tonight?
No, thank you. That was great, and I really enjoyed the questions and the invitation. And I'm very supportive of the job CCL is doing in the US, and I hope it's gonna work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, we feel the exact same way. Back to you. And with that, I'll unmute all lines so that we can all say a huge thank you. Thank you again so much, Adrien, for being up past midnight now.
Thanks very much.
Great.
Thank you much.
Thank you.
Thank
Merci
you.
beaucoup.
Very
Wait,
good.
I got confused on the time.
Merci.
All right, be well.